Hey, Nathan Cole. Before we start, I should warn you that today's ocean disasters are genuinely hard to stomach. Forget typical shipwrecks. These are deeply disturbing. From passengers who survived a collision only to drown trapped beneath a container ship, to a fisherman who spent years chasing giant marlin, and when he finally caught one, he never came home. It was August 14th, 2017, before sunrise. The Karnafuli River shipping channel near Chattogram, Bangladesh, was calm with good visibility. Port operations ran normally as small passenger launches navigated the water. However, a routine crossing suddenly turned into a devastating nightmare, leaving people trapped just out of reach of rescuers. Like every weekday morning, 42-year-old Abdul Rahman was at work before dawn. He had spent nearly 20 years operating a small wooden passenger launch across the river, connecting residential areas to the local factories and docks. Most of his passengers were regulars. He knew them all, who worked night shifts, who was going to school, and who always sat in the same seat. For those aboard, Abdul represented total safety and routine. That morning, 16 passengers boarded shortly after 5:30 a.m. Among them were a 19-year-old nursing student heading to her internship, a garment worker, and a grandfather taking his grandson fishing. The crossing usually took less than 15 minutes, a quick, everyday commute. Just after departure, Abdul approached one of the commercial shipping lanes. The weather was clear, and visibility extended well beyond 2 miles. Nothing suggested danger. At the same time, a fully loaded container ship was moving inbound. The vessel towered above the river. Like many massive ships, it had a huge blind spot right in front of the bow, where small boats could completely disappear. Investigators later concluded that Abdul believed he had enough time to cross. It's a classic, fatal miscalculation. He continued into the lane. The ship maintained course, and neither vessel radioed the other. Within moments, the tiny launch entered that blind zone. A nearby captain reported hearing a prolonged horn blast, then frantic shouting, and that sound alone must have been pure terror for anyone watching from the shore. The collision happened almost immediately. The massive ship struck the wooden launch broadside, splintering it apart. Several passengers were thrown into the river, and one side of the launch sank within seconds. But here is the most harrowing part. A section of the forward passenger compartment didn't sink. The impact forced it beneath the ship's hull, wedging it against structural supports. Inside, 6 passengers survived the initial crash. An air pocket formed as water flooded around them, including that 19-year-old nursing student. Rescue divers arrived within minutes. At first, they thought the noises under the ship were just debris. Then they heard knocking. Can you imagine the chills? Because reading that genuinely gives me goosebumps. Divers descended repeatedly and located the trapped compartment. The situation was desperate. Moving the wreck risked collapsing the air pocket. Divers tried to find a way through the shattered wood, and one even saw a flashlight beam moving through a narrow crack. It's just devastating to think about. They were right there. For nearly 40 minutes, rescuers worked furiously while survivors remained trapped just feet away. Then, the knocking gradually slowed, and then it stopped. By the time a salvage crane cleared enough wreckage, the compartment had completely flooded, and all 6 survivors were gone. The post-mortem examination revealed a devastating detail. None of them died from the crash. They all survived the impact. The cause of death was drowning. Investigators found severe damage to their fingertips, showing how desperately they tried to tear through the wooden panels. One victim still held a functioning flashlight. Another held a phone, with records showing a final outgoing call lasting 43 seconds before disconnecting. It's just heartbreaking to think about. The official report blamed the launch for entering the lane without clearance, noting the ship's crew never saw them. Today, new crossing corridors and tracking laws are in place, but the image that stays with everyone is a photo of the ship sitting motionless while divers worked. Investigators later confirmed that when that photo was taken, 6 people were still alive, waiting for help just beneath the bow. In the next case, there was no massive ship, no blind spot, just a lone fisherman, a blue marlin that struck at highway speed, and a loop of line that closed around his ankle in under a second. It was April 22, 2018. Batangas Bay, Philippines, was calm before sunrise, with a light breeze moving across the water. Local fishing boats departed the shoreline one by one, heading toward the deeper channels for the spring migration. The atmosphere was peaceful as the community began its routine morning work. Long before daylight, 58-year-old Rolando de la Cruz was already at the docks preparing his small wooden boat. He had spent nearly 40 years fishing the waters of Batangas Bay, and for that long, I can honestly say he knew those waters better than most people know their own backyard. His boat, Ligaya, named after his wife, had carried him safely through thousands of trips. Shortly after 5 in the morning, Rolando left the harbor and headed several miles offshore toward a deep-water channel known for seasonal blue marlin migrations. It was the kind of fishing ground that few small boats worked because the fish there were enormous. Now, just like generations of Philippine fishermen before him, Rolando relied entirely on traditional methods. His main line was a heavy hand line coiled on the deck and tied directly to a large hook. There were no reels, harnesses, or safety releases. In this style of fishing, if something powerful takes the bait, your body becomes part of the fight. The sea was calm that morning. Around 6:30 a.m., something struck the bait with incredible force. Investigators later estimated it was a blue marlin weighing more than 600 pounds. The impact was so violent that the entire coil of line exploded across the deck, and what happened next was reconstructed entirely from physical evidence. During the strike, one loop of line wrapped around Rolando's right ankle. As the marlin accelerated, the loop tightened instantly. He likely had no opportunity to free himself. The line ripped across the deck with tremendous force. Investigators documented deep grooves carved into the wood from stern to bow. Equipment had been torn loose and scattered. The evidence pointed to a horrifying sequence. Rolando was dragged the length of his own boat before being pulled overboard. And this is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing for me. Blue marlin can reach speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour in short bursts. Investigators concluded that Rolando didn't simply fall into the sea. He remained attached to the fish. Deep compression injuries later found around his ankle showed the line stayed secured long after he entered the water. Just think about that for a second. He wasn't treading water waiting for help. He was being dragged through open ocean by a terrified animal weighing hundreds of pounds, miles from shore, and completely beyond the reach of anyone who could save him. At 9:05 a.m., a commercial fishing crew spotted Ligaya moving in slow circles with its engine still running. Expecting a mechanical problem, they approached the vessel. Instead, they found an empty boat. The throttle remained set to trolling speed. Fishing gear was scattered everywhere. Deep gouges cut across the deck where the line had torn forward under immense tension. The crew immediately alerted the Coast Guard and began searching nearby waters. Several hours later, another fishing vessel working roughly 4 miles away reported something unusual. A large blue marlin was repeatedly surfacing and struggling near the surface with a length of heavy fishing line trailing behind it. The crew maneuvered alongside the fish and prepared to recover it. As they hauled the line upward, they realized it was still attached to something beneath the water. What they pulled up shocked everyone on board. Rolando was still attached to the marlin. Investigators later determined that the line had never broken. The fish had dragged him for miles before eventually exhausting itself. By the time the second crew discovered it, both the marlin and the fisherman remained connected by the same hand line involved in the original strike. The medical examiner concluded Rolando drowned shortly after being pulled overboard. The deep groove around his ankle showed the line had tightened with enormous force and remained secured throughout the incident. But the detail that disturbed investigators most wasn't how Rolando died. It was what they found. Recovery photographs showed the marlin still hooked, the line still attached, and Rolando still connected to the same fish that had pulled him overboard hours earlier. Just imagine being the crew that found it. They thought they were hauling in the catch of a lifetime. Instead, they found the fisherman who had caught it. The next story doesn't happen in open water. It happens inside the steel belly of a fishing vessel, where 4 men entered a refrigerated hold. A hatch closed behind them, and a corroded ammonia line turned the room into a trap. It was August 17th, 2016. The Bay of Bengal was calm, 70 nautical miles south of Cox's Bazar. Fishing conditions were exceptionally good. By midnight, the crew was entirely focused on securing a massive catch. Below deck, a routine inspection was underway, unaware of the imminent danger developing within the vessel. 3 days offshore, 36-year-old Javed Karim was one of the most experienced guys aboard the Sonar Tara. He had spent 15 years on these waters and actually understood refrigeration and engines. Captains loved him because he usually caught mechanical issues before they turned serious. Ever since his wife passed away 2 years earlier, work had become the center of Javed's life. With help from his parents, he was raising his 8-year-old daughter on the income he earned at sea. Every trip mattered. The longer he stayed offshore, the more money he brought home for his family. That week, the catch was huge, but the refrigerated fish hold started warming up. It used an aging ammonia-based system that had already been patched up way too many times. Turning back early meant losing the catch and their payday. So when crewmen smelled something sharp, the captain decided to investigate. You can understand the financial pressure, but it turned out to be a fatal gamble. Just before midnight, Javed and 3 others went below deck. Access meant climbing down a narrow ladder through a heavy insulated hatch into a cold, steel-walled room. To keep the cold in, the crew topside closed the hatch behind them. That right there is a detail that just makes your stomach drop. Within minutes, shouting echoed from below. Then, a loud metallic crack. Then silence. A corroded ammonia line had ruptured. Pressurized anhydrous ammonia flooded the room, instantly blinding the men and burning their eyes, noses, and throats. The gas was highly toxic at that concentration, and every breath caused severe chemical burns inside their airways and lungs. They were trapped in total darkness. A deckhand cracked the hatch, but the toxic chemical cloud drove him back. Another guy tied a cloth over his face to try a rescue, but he collapsed in seconds and had to be dragged out. The captain radioed for help, but rescue was hours away, and they had 0 breathing gear aboard. For nearly an hour, the crew could hear banging from below deck. Then, it got weaker and eventually stopped. When rescuers finally opened the ventilated room the next morning, the scene was devastating. 2 victims were at the ladder. One was by a shutoff valve. Javed was closest to the hatch. The autopsy showed severe chemical burns throughout their respiratory systems. Medical examiners found extensive damage to the lining of their lungs, along with fluid buildup caused by ammonia inhalation. The worst part? Investigators concluded the men likely remained conscious for several minutes while struggling to breathe, as their airways became increasingly damaged and swollen. They also had fractures and deep bruising on their hands from desperately pounding on the steel hatch. The official investigation later blamed corrosion in the aging pipes. Instead of replacing the line, the boat owners had just done some cheap patchwork repairs. And to make matters worse, they didn't have a single gas detector or breathing mask on board. It's just so senseless. You see this kind of corporate corner cutting all the time, and it's infuriating because you know it was 100% preventable. They traded human lives to save a few bucks. Next, a 67-year-old woman, a dive she had done her entire life, and a basket of 9 oysters sitting in an empty boat. She always collected 10 before going home. If you're interested in these stories, hit subscribe right now, because the next case we are about to get into is the one that genuinely disturbed our research team the most. It was March 14, 2017. Kuwait Bay was unusually calm that morning, showing barely a ripple. Local fishermen described it as a perfect, comfortable day. It was exactly the kind of serene, inviting weather where deep experience can quietly replace necessary caution, making the environment appear entirely safe and deceptive to those out on it. For nearly her entire life, 67-year-old Fatima al-Rashidi worked the waters of Kuwait Bay. She was believed to be one of the last traditional pearl divers in her community. While most divers had long since switched to modern equipment or retired altogether, Fatima still relied on methods that had changed very little over generations. A woven basket, a weighted descent stone, and a rope tied to her small wooden dhow. Years of diving had taken a toll on her body. She suffered from chronic sinus problems, partial hearing loss, and recurring dizziness. Doctors had advised her to stop diving years earlier. Her family begged her to slow down. Fatima heard them out, then kept diving anyway. The sea wasn't just her job, it was her identity. And if I'm being honest, I think a lot of people understand that feeling. That morning, conditions were perfect. The oyster bed she planned to work sat only about 23 feet below the surface. It was familiar territory. She had harvested oysters from the same area for nearly 3 decades. Investigators later determined she completed several successful dives throughout the morning. The The routine never changed. Clip the nose, grip the descent stone, drop to the bottom, fill the basket, then return to the surface. By late morning, she was preparing for what would likely be her final dive of the day. To extend her time underwater, investigators believe Fatima hyperventilated before descending. That decision likely killed her. Hyperventilation removes carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. The problem is that carbon dioxide, not oxygen, is what triggers the urge to breathe. A diver can feel completely comfortable while oxygen levels quietly fall to dangerous levels. Evidence showed Fatima reached the bottom without difficulty. Divers later recovered fresh oyster shells and her descent stone exactly where they should have been. She completed the dive and began ascending normally. There was no equipment failure, no entanglement, no sign of panic. According to diving experts, Fatima was only a few feet from the surface when her oxygen level dropped below the threshold needed to maintain consciousness. She blacked out instantly. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Investigators believe her body continued rising after she lost consciousness. By the time she reached the surface, she was no longer capable of calling for help or pulling herself back into the boat. Later interviews revealed that at least one fisherman had passed through the area earlier that morning and noticed Fatima's dhow sitting motionless on the water. He assumed she was below collecting oysters and continued on his way. Another boater later reported seeing something floating beside the vessel, but assumed it was a buoy or a piece of fishing equipment and continued on his way. It's so incredibly frustrating to read that. You want to scream at them to just turn the boat around and look closer, but nobody stopped to investigate, and nobody realized anything was wrong. Hours passed before a local fisherman became concerned that Fatima's dhow had remained in the same position all morning. When he finally approached the vessel around 11:40 a.m., he immediately saw the problem. Fatima was floating face down less than 3 feet from the hull, while her basket still hung over the side and the rope attached to her descent stone disappeared into the water below. Everything looked exactly as it would have during a normal dive, except Fatima never climbed back aboard. The medical examiner confirmed she suffered a shallow water blackout followed by drowning. There was no heart attack, stroke, or equipment malfunction. She simply lost consciousness during the final seconds of her ascent. But investigators were struck by the recovery scene. The boat was untouched, the equipment was untouched, the water was calm, and Fatima was found so close to safety that she could have touched the side of her boat had she remained conscious for only a few more seconds. Just think about how eerie that must have looked. An empty, pearl-diving boat drifting under a clear sky, a basket hanging over the side, a rope disappearing into the water, and a diver floating beside it for hours while people passed by, assuming everything was normal. The next story will make you angry. The thing that killed him was already on his neck before he ever caught a wave, and nobody on that beach recognized the danger until it was far too late. It was January 14, 2017, and Mission Beach in Queensland faced larger than usual surf, creating busy but manageable water conditions. Although lifeguards noted active jellyfish along the shoreline, the ocean appeared deceptively safe. Most beachgoers entered the water completely unaware of the morning warnings, as nothing immediately signaled danger across the crowded coast. Earlier that summer, 22-year-old Peter Kai Makoa had arrived in Australia from Hawaii. He spent 6 months moving between hostels and temporary jobs, just chasing surf breaks. Most people knew him simply as Kai. Like many travelers, he lived for the ocean. Friends described him as determined. Honestly, maybe a bit overly confident at times. If conditions looked rough, he'd convince himself he could handle it. But here's the thing. While he had surfed for years in Hawaii, he had almost zero experience with Australia's tropical marine hazards. And that's a completely different beast. That morning, a strong weather system brought in massive swells. Local authorities had issued seasonal warnings about box jellyfish, but let's be real, these warnings are so routine they often get ignored. To make matters worse, several warning signs on the beach had been damaged by wind overnight and weren't replaced yet. Shortly before noon, Kai paddled out. Conditions were tough, but not extreme. Witnesses said he looked totally relaxed, waiting nearly 20 minutes for a clean wave. Nothing seemed wrong. But during that wait, something happened that no one recognized. A few surfers later remembered seeing Kai repeatedly touch the left side of his neck. One thought he was just brushing away seaweed. Another assumed it was a harmless bluebottle sting. breaks my heart to think about it, but nobody realized how serious it actually was. A few minutes later, Kai turned to catch one of the bigger waves. Cell phone footage showed him dropping cleanly down the face. He stood up normally and looked in full control. Then, suddenly, his movements changed. His stance widened, his arms shook, and he missed a turn he easily should have made. He fell forward into the water. The wipeout itself wasn't even that violent, but when Kai resurfaced, it was clear something was horribly wrong. Instead of grabbing his board, he looked completely confused, struggled to orient himself, and collapsed back into the water. Nearby surfers reached him within seconds and rolled him onto his back. Kai was already unconscious. Lifeguards got him to shore in about 3 minutes, where his skin was pale and his breathing stopped. Despite immediate CPR and paramedics arriving 9 minutes later, Kai never woke up. Initially, everyone assumed the wipeout caused a head or spinal injury, but investigators found nothing of the sort. Instead, the coroner found faint tentacle marks on Kai's neck and shoulder. It was box jellyfish venom. The venom had triggered a severe cardiac arrhythmia. In plain English, his heart's electrical signals went haywire. Investigators concluded he was already dizzy and losing coordination before he even caught the wave. The sting caused the collapse. The wipeout was just a byproduct. The official cause of death was box jellyfish envenomation, with drowning contributing. Later, investigators found a faint red line beneath his ear. This only means that he had been stung while just sitting on his board. Think about that. He was just floating there, completely relaxed, with absolutely no idea that an invisible killer had already targeted him. Afterward, friends found a notebook in Kai's hostel filled with sketches of Australian beaches. The very last page showed Mission Beach. The drawing stopped halfway through a wave, a tragic echo of a ride he never got to finish.